Dear Sir, my son was killed September 1940 in the London docks and belonged to RN Patrol. I wrote at the time and inquired where he was buried and was informed at the East London Cemetery. I have not been able to go to the cemetery until after the war. For one thing, I had an invalid husband who has since died and several children. Imagine my surprise when I went there this summer to find no records there at all of his death. I found a communal grave myself and saw there were 2 crosses there of naval men who were killed on September the 7th. I have now established my son's identity and he is buried in the West Ham communal grave and the number is 187. I have now inquired about a cross for my son and they tell me I must apply through my son's unit. Would you please advise me what next I have to do? Thank you very much for a reply. Yours faithfully, Mrs. M.E. Langley.
The weekend the Germans didn't invade. An audio play of the events of the 7th and 8th of September 1940, performed by the Axholme Academy, their community and friends.
Part 1. Waiting.
A few minutes to midnight.
As the clock hands edged towards 12, the temperature eased to something bearable. The first week of September had been hot. East Ham and Kensington were united in heat, if nothing else, as they both reported 87 degrees Fahrenheit, 30.5 degrees centigrade, on the 4th. Although the mercury had edged down a degree or two today, the Sussex coast still managed to record monthly records. So far the Luftwaffe had concentrated on the airfields in preparation for the invasion, which would see the Blitzkrieg sweep the ill-prepared defenders from the Kentish coast and onwards to London.
British summertime was in full force, and the middle of the night wouldn't come till 1 a.m. Summertime, it had been announced on the 5th, would go on till the 17th of November. No one had told the weather this, and at 5 to midnight the Bell Rock Lighthouse experienced its windiest moment of the month as the gale that was heading across Scotland battered it with 54 miles per hour winds.
The Home Intelligence report for today noted the public continued to take the bombings in good heart. In London, last night's alarm was talked of jokingly for the most part, and fewer people complained of tiredness today, more of sleeping through the night alarms. An increasingly fatalistic attitude towards the effect of bombings is reported, and this appears to be coupled with a high state of morale. In the East End, the searchlights, rather than the sirens, are now taken as a sign for going to the shelters. Cooperation and friendliness in the public shelters are reported to be increasing, but there are many complaints about the unsanitary messes in shelters, and improper behaviour of various varieties is causing distress among the more respectable elements of the community.
The Luftwaffe had been busy on the 6th. Liverpool experienced a rare daylight raid in which 10 people were killed and a chemical works destroyed. Damage was done to 14 ambulances and the Anglican Cathedral. At 0900, 1300 and 1900, the Germans followed the Thames estuary towards the capital before peeling off to attack RAF airfields at Helston, Kenley and Biggin Hill, the Brooklands Hawker factory, which suffered little, and the Thames Haven oil storage tanks, which burnt with great plumes of black smoke. The Germans lost 37 fighters and 7 bombers, the RAF 22 fighters. This was not the end of the German presence over London that day.
By September, people had begun to settle down to the routine of war. The nuisance raids were precisely a nuisance because they interrupted the routines of life. The civil service had been given permission this week to stay at their desks after the siren went until a real danger existed. The military correspondent of the Daily Gazette for Middlesbrough on the 4th of September was of the opinion that if roof watchers, appointed to look out for fires, could be allowed to give a signal that a raid now really threatened the habit of working through the siren would soon spread.
At 8 o'clock, the 24th Promenade concert began in the Queen's Hall. In the audience to hear the overture from Fidelio was Miss P. Walker. She noted in her diary, "It was a Beethoven concert, and although the warning had gone, the entire hall was packed with a mammoth audience. On to a theatre where a further warning had no effect on a big audience, and then to a restaurant jam-packed with jovial beings, and home through streets whizzing with traffic under an impressive display of searchlights."
The impending invasion increased tension and could lead to tragic accidents. Just after 11 o'clock, 2 soldiers were patrolling near Burniston Aerodrome in Derbyshire when they spotted a car parked up. Challenging the occupants, they were ignored. Opening fire, the soldiers killed the driver. Unfortunately, the motorists were not Nazi spies, and he had hit Major Locker, head of the local Home Guard. The St John's Ambulance Brigade were called out, but not allowed near the car, which was, by then, surrounded by soldiers. Major Locker, a nickname given to him by local boys as he held no official rank, had used his car to inspect his troops. On this occasion, he and Mrs. Locker had parked up. The soldiers had not spotted the LDV label on the windscreen, and Major Locker, who was severely deaf, probably didn't hear the challenge and died at the scene.
BBC Radio Home Services. Midnight for news. 12:20 News in Norwegian. 12:30 Network closure till 6:45 a.m.
The first bomb to land in the Greater London area on the 7th of September was at 8 minutes past midnight. The incendiary device landed on grocers at 43 Southwark Park Road, Bermondsey, creating a roughly metre-square hole in the roof.
A second hit a baker's at number 49 and did the same damage. In all, 34 bomb incidents were recorded by the fire brigade as falling in the first hour.
An individual incendiary bomb was a threat that could be dealt with by quickly trained volunteers, but en masse they could overwhelm the fire services. The idea of some group of observers began to develop in 1939, and by June 1939, volunteers were sought to become fire watchers. The idea was that groups of 3 to 5 people could be trained to deal with small fires on a street-by-street basis. In April, the fire authorities had been made responsible for the selection and training of the supplementary fire parties, and the issue of 75,000 stirrup pumps was ordered. Those unsure on the use of the pump could attend the lectures, such as those the Derby Auxiliary Fire Service, the AFS, were offering at 7:30 p.m. on Tuesday the 10th.
Domestic damage by incendiaries was limited and minor. The Astoria Cinema in the Old Kent Road had a hole in the roof and 4 seats slightly damaged. The biggest loss was the RAF shed in Sandhurst Road School, Catford. Mostly minor damage was done to single rooms. Explosive bombs were a little different. In Catford, a single bomb damaged 17 private houses in Jutland Road, and 3 houses were severely damaged in Sportsbank Street. St Cyprian's Church, only completed in 1901, of Adelaide Avenue, Brockley, was badly damaged, with Father Thorley Hurst and his verger, Mr Cooper, trapped in the basement. While both men were rescued, but the effect on Father seems to have been profound. The church was not rebuilt and finally declared redundant in 1959.
In County Durham, German planes dropped bombs in the countryside west of Stockton-on-Tees. An estimated 100 incendiaries were dropped on Hangthorne Farm, Long Newton, with little damage once the fires were brought under control.
The Home Guard of Hythe watched out for invaders from their position in the engine house. They had spent the week camouflaging their rifle pit and reinforcing the parapet with oil drums. Living conditions had been improved by obtaining 2 beach huts with sprung mattress bunks.
1 a.m.
Bombs did not so much rain down on London as slightly drizzled. Minor fire damage was reported in many thoroughfares in Catford. At 1:52, an unexploded bomb landed in the garden of 58 Brownhill Road.
These would be reported in today's The Scotsman as bombs cause fires in London. During London's fourth warning yesterday, high explosive and incendiary bombs fell in the streets in the area. There were several casualties and fires broke out.
219 Squadron was based at Catterick. Originally it had been tasked to protect North Sea shipping, but was repurposed as a night fighter squadron, and detachments were spread thinly across the north of England. On the 15th of August, the squadron was committed to day action when Germans had launched their only major daylight raid on northern England, and the squadron was sent to intercept the Luftwaffe as it crossed the Yorkshire coast. The limitations of the Blenheim were shown up here when one chased a Junkers 88 for 160 miles with no result.
The night raiders probably were more concerned by the dangers of poor navigation and mechanic failures than the developing RAF night fighter forces.
In early September, the Royal Air Force had spread these aircraft across the country. 23 Squadron was equipped with Bristol Blenheims and stationed at Collyweston near Stamford. The Blenheim was a converted light bomber. Its low speed meant it had difficulty in catching up with raiders. This was partially offset by the fitting them with radar, but this was still a work in progress. 25 Squadron Northolt and 29 Squadron Wellinghall, 12 miles south of Lincoln, also had Blenheims. 307 Lwowski Squadron had been formed round a corps of Polish pilots at Curtin in Lindsey on 5th of September, but would not be operational until October. Bomber Command, like Fighter Command, had welcomed Polish flyers. The most recently formed was 305 Ziemia Wielkopolska Squadron. Formed a week ago at RAF Browncoat, they had been equipped with the obsolete Fairy Battle.
In Folkestone, the Home Guard cyclists watched for signs of impending invasion. Eric Hart recalled, "The modest size of our platoon meant that each member was called upon to carry out a tour of duty at least 2 nights per week, on the basis of 2 hours on duty and an hour's rest period. The cycle patrol took us along the restricted Undercliff Road."
The coastal communities which had depended on holidaymakers were suffering from a combination of travel bans, conscripted customers and evacuated locals. In June, the Ministry of Home Security had requested that people restrict travel within 20 miles of the Kent, Essex, Suffolk, Norfolk and South Lincolnshire coasts. The Kensington Post's reporter noted, with surprise, on the 20th of June that this included motorists and not just rail travellers. Rail companies listed over 700 destinations which were not to be gone to for frivolous reasons of pleasure, and throughout the entire summer of 1940, Great Yarmouth only received 750 independent-minded holidaymakers.
Residents were encouraged to move out of the danger zone. 70% of Walton-on-the-Naze homes were shut up, and Clacton's normal summer population of 25,000 was reduced to just 5,000.
2 a.m.
While southern England had sunned itself in early September, more northern parts of the British Isles had been less blessed. Some parts of Scotland were to see gales on half of the days of the month, and the night of the 6th to the 7th saw the most severe of them. The gale that had buffeted the Bellrock Lighthouse was heading south.
South East London continued to suffer the attention of the Luftwaffe. 3 incendiaries damaging, amongst other things, a bakery in the Old Kent Road and a grocer in Bermondsey. Falling shrapnel hit 52 Brownhill Road and 84 Tresselin Road.
Bombs also fell on South Welsh coastal towns and in the countryside towards the mining valleys. The Western Mail managed to put a positive gloss over the matter, noting that although 9 explosive bombs had been dropped on a compact residential area, but the only fatality was a dog killed by shrapnel. Mr. and Mrs. Fred Richmond had the front of their council house damaged and observed, "Isn't it very airy?" They admitted to the reporter that they had been lucky, and Mrs. Richmond was very proud of the quality of her mirror, which had been blown from the wall but was still intact.
The air raid siren had become a feature of everyday life. In February 1934, the House of Commons had finally debated the issue. In July of that year, the French staged an air raid practice. Belgium followed, and in the spirit of the age, the City of Worcester Electricity Works used its Great War Siren to announce the start of November's 2-minute silence. By May 1935, thoughts of air raids were engaging the minds of civic authorities. The Medway towns practiced a blackout, using short blasts on sirens and sound rockets to warn of the approaching aircraft. In January 1936, the Home Office began testing sirens to find out how effective they were. One, placed on top of the roof of a factory in Walthamstow, was audibly locally, but police, instructed to listen in Hornsey and Tottenham, heard nothing. Further tests continued across the year. The Sheffield Independent somewhat crushingly reported on a test in Liverpool. It noted, "The whole thing was an experiment to test whether the noise of the siren which is erected on the flat roof of St George's Hall could be heard in the suburban districts. It could not." By the autumn, increasing numbers of councils were practising air raid drills and sirens were being erected.
The air raids of the 6th to 7th of September saw a new approach. The Ministry of Home Security reduced the air raid warning siren from 2 to 1 minute. The Birmingham Daily Gazette noted the Germans had already done that weeks ago. One London district had instructed ARP wardens to blow whistles before the siren as an experiment.
3 a.m.
The need for fire watchers was demonstrated at 3:15 when a 3-storey building and its contents was severely damaged in 12 Hertford Street, Stepney. It was one of the only 2 incidents that happened this hour. The other was a damaged roof, but no fire in Mile End.
The Air Ministry and Ministry of Home Security statement about the night's attack was as follows. Last night, enemy aircraft again made scattered raids over this country. The main attacks were developed before midnight and were directed against London and towns in the northwest. Elsewhere, although bombs have been dropped in most areas of England, damage and casualties have in general been slight. Since midnight, activity has been much curtailed. In London, high explosive bombs, which fell mainly in eastern and southern districts, damaged industrial buildings and houses and caused a number of fires, which are now extinguished or under control. A hospital, a church hall and a warehouse were hit. Some damage was done to water and gas mains, and by reason of road damage, temporary diversion of traffic has in places been necessary. Some persons have been killed and in a number of others injured in these districts. In the northwest, damage was done. Several towns and a number of fires caused. A convalescent home for children was hit, and though there were some casualties, none were fatal. Elsewhere in the area, a number of casualties were small, but included some fatal injuries.
Berlin issued its own version. Last night's attacks on the British Isles were particularly successful. There were sustained attacks on harbours and munition factories. Manchester, Liverpool and Derby were the targets of the German attack. At many points, fires were caused. Storage tanks, grain warehouses and cold storage buildings were hit and harbour installations destroyed. There were above all concentrated attacks on Liverpool, where the German planes unloaded their bombs on grain stores and mills. In Manchester, there were various hits to the harbour basin. These unceasing attacks on England's supply centres have resulted in considerable reduction in imports of essential goods. Liverpool has been so successfully attacked that shortage of food for the British population can be expected. London port installations were again attacked last night, and 2 German formations dropped many incendiary and high explosive bombs. German bombers also visited Scotland last night. On the return journey, a German formation bombed a convoy in the waters northeast of Aberdeen. A merchant ship of 6,000 tons sank at once. Another developed a list. 2 others were seriously damaged and stopped. 1 German plane crashed into the sea. South Wales was also attacked last night. German bombers who got through the barrage without difficulty attacked Cardiff as the main target. Considerable damage was done in the harbour.
The increasing threat of an invasion meant the Royal Navy put all light forces on immediate notice of action in the dark hours. Convoys down the east coast were suspended.
RAF Bomber Command sent 68 Blenheims, Hamdens, Wellingtons and Whiteleys to targets across France, Germany and Belgium. 2 planes were lost. 4 a.m.
No bombs fell. The fire brigade was not called out. Londoners slept, except all those who needed to get up to get the market supplied and the newspapers out. The headlines from around the Isles included:
Aberdeen Press, submarine cheats Nazi raider of prey.
Birmingham Daily Gazette, Iron Guard take revenge.
Gloucestershire Echo, Berlin gets its biggest raid of the war.
Liverpool Daily Post, RAF smashes intense raids.
The Western Daily Press included an article entitled "Why Civilians Should Stay Put." In an invasion, the civilian who leaves his home without orders and flies in any direction that will take him away from the nearest enemy is betraying his country.
The papers carried news of children evacuated to Canada. In return, Canadian troops were coming to Britain. The Staffordshire Sentinels noted that the latest batch to arrive landed just as the air raid sirens were going off, but the troops did not want to take cover because they wanted to see what was going on.
"5 a.m. The East Coast curfew end.
Coastal curfews had been in place since July, although they varied from region to region. West Sussex had begun a 5 p.m. to 5 a.m. ban on the 3rd of July, initially for 2 days. The lengths varied, and even the exact area of the exclusion zone. Today it was announced that in Hastings, Harold Place, Robinson Street and Claremont were now curfew-free, so people were not to be excluded from them from 10:30 p.m. to the end of the blackout next day. 45 miles of the Yorkshire coast had been curfewed on the 12th of July, with a 10:30 to an hour before sunrise. Similar restrictions in July and August were in place throughout the east and southern coastal areas. Yorkshire's curfew ended on the 31st of October.
5:39 a.m. Twilight begins in Kirkwall.
The Royal Navy Patrol Service had been established in 1907. The Admiralty had taken over the trawlers and used them for minesweeping and other similar operations in wartime. A central depot, called HMS Europa, was established at Lowestoft.
Harold Kettison was born in Grimsby on the 19th of October 1900. His father was a fisherman from Great Yarmouth who had married Kate Maidens from Wainfleet, and they'd settled down in Lincolnshire. In 1924, Harold married Kate Brow. They had 3 children, although the youngest, Shirley, had not survived her first year. In 1939, they were living at 50 Wharton Street with their 12-year-old daughter Audrey and 10-year-old son Kenneth. Harold and his brother William had been awarded the Mercantile Marine and British Medal in 1919 for working in the fishing fleets during wartime. His appointment as trawler skipper of the Abronia marked him out as one of those men who were not going to be deployed for General Navy service but for a specific task, keeping the East Coast shipping lanes open for convoys, especially now the English Channel was closed to merchant ships.
Ordinary signalman John Morley had been waiting to go to his new ship since he had been drafted from the Royal Navy to the patrol service on 28th June. As he explained to his mother, he sent to his Plymouth home on 4th September. Today was the day he finally joined the Abronia.
William Langler was born to serve on the Abronia as a seaman cook. While his mother and father had moved to Brixham, Langler had been born in Southend and lived in Rochford. He joined the Royal Navy Patrol Service for the length of the war only.
Stoker John Nelson was only just 20 when he was sent to join HMT Abronia. Nelson was from Sunderland and he'd lived in Hilton Road, Millfield, with his wife Anne.
5:47 a.m. Twilight begins in London.
German planes returned in small numbers around dawn. Of the 4 reported incidents, the most significant was a fire caused in a timber importer's in Plowray by the Surrey Quays.
Milkmen made their deliveries. 2,000 gallons of free or cheap milk were distributed every day in Aberdeen City and County Kincardine. The National Milk Scheme, established in July 1940, which had been designed to aid the under-5s and expectant mothers, could receive a pint of milk at the subsidised rate of 2 pennies. By September, the uptake was about 70% of all those entitled, with those on low incomes about 30% of the uptake getting the milk free. Suppliers who felt the need could, according to Mr. G. Bennett Mitchell, Northeast Division Food Officer, pay extra and buy milk that had been sterilised or tested for tuberculosis.
The age of deliverers was not yet past, but it was presenting problems. Customers who had been used to ordering groceries and having a van arrive with them faced the twin problems of lack of drivers, as the men joined up, and lack of petrol for the vans. The Aberdeen Journal noted that vans were increasingly sticking to the main roads and basket-wielding customers had to leave the back lanes to meet them.
Recycling had become a priority for a nation that suddenly had to consider what exactly each incoming ship carried. The Ministry of Supply had established a national salvage scheme in December 1939. Local authorities were used as agencies to organise the collection of waste products. In turn, these used bodies such as the WVS to channel local enthusiasm. Another way to inspire collectors was the National Salvage Stakes. The newspapers found front-page space for the news of the July results. Scottish councils won, collecting £11 and 16 shillings of scrap per 1,000 people. English, i.e. non-Scottish urban district councils, came next, followed by Metropolitan London and rural districts third. On average, each area collected £7 per 1,000 people. However, Hampstead championed London with £14, 8 shillings, and Edinburgh topped Scotland with £17. The City of London, with so many warehouses and offices, it was suggested, was a special case with £57. With no sense of irony or arithmetical understanding, the Birmingham Daily Gazette lamented that many were below average.
5:51 a.m. Curfew ends in Hastings.
5:52 a.m. The blackout ends in Hull.
6:04 a.m. Twilight, Belfast.
BBC Forces Programme. 06:15 News in French. 06:30 Reveille, a cheerful selection of gramophone records.
BBC Home Services. 6:45 a.m. News in Norwegian.
No bombs fell on Greater London this hour, and the fire brigade was not called out.
The London Civil Defence Report, issued at 600, reported 109 fires had happened last night, but only 5 were serious. The areas more affected were West Ham, Bermondsey, Southwark and Camberwell. 20 people had been killed and 115 injured.
6:17 a.m. Sunrise, London.
The Saturday papers carried the usual small ads. Amongst the accommodation wanted were the following. Wanted, urgently, country houses or cottages within 15 miles of city of Bristol.
6:22 a.m. Sunrise, Kirkwall.
Italy had been on the minds of the government. The Italians entered into yet another war in June 1940 when, with the hope of grasping some of the spoils of victory, she declared war on the Allies during the death throes of France. Marshal Graziani's offensive had been faltering and cost about 640 dead, compared to about 40 French. But by this stage of events, France had been beaten in the north, with 832 kilometres squared and 28,500 people being added to the Kingdom of Italy.
Italian entry into the war added a new dimension to the concerns of Allied planners. The vital sea lanes from the Suez through the Mediterranean now faced assault, as did strategic points such as Malta and Gibraltar. In East Africa, the Italians had invaded and captured the British Somalians in August, and fighting continued in the border regions of Sudan and Kenya. In truth, both sides were desperately under-resourced in this theatre. The importance of the Suez Canal was that in August, 30% of the nation's cruiser tanks, with 50 infantry and 52 light tanks, were sent out to Egypt. On the 9th of September, the Italians invaded.
While the Italians posed problems for the planners, they also provided some good news, which Saturday's papers made the most of. The Western Mail waxed lyrical today. How Navy made clean sweep of Italian opposition. Masters of inland sea fled before bases were bombed. The information based on an Admiralty communique from Cairo. It quoted, "The enemy battle fleet was sighted by our aircraft when about 150 miles from ours. As he turned north towards his base, no contact was possible." Elsewhere, they reported 5 enemy aircraft had been shot down. HMAS Sydney, with 2 destroyers, bombarded Macchiaiello, and HMS Ajax sank 2 E-boats.
6:34 a.m. sunrise, Cardiff.
Newsagents and tobacconists began to open across the country.
According to tobacco industry figures, half of over 16s were smokers. Daily consumption was on the rise, doubling between 1914 and 1945. One way the British public could show support for the services was to contribute to one of the many schemes run by local papers to provide fags for the troops. The Rochdale Observer announced it would be printing a form for people to nominate someone to receive cigarettes from them. Nominees had to come from Rochdale, Castleton, Norden, Littleborough, Whitlow, Milnrow or Wardle, and had to be in the Army, Navy or Air Force. 24 sailors had received a parcel last week. Each was named and 18 more were to benefit. So far, 20,459.25 shillings had been donated, about 5% of which was given anonymously. How donators described themselves in the published list varied. ARP Warden, number 147 and family, gave 2 shillings. Good luck to our daddy, Lever and Billy gave the same. Miss Eileen Barlow, 4 East View, Whitworth, 9th contribution, gave 5 shillings. The average price of cigarettes cost 5 shillings and 3 pennies.
6:41 a.m. sunrise, Belfast.
BBC Home Services. 7 a.m. News. 7:15 Morning Star. Records of Frei Ambrogiotti, the well-known piano team. 7:30 Up in the morning early. Exercises for women. 7:45 a.m. Interlude Records. 7:50 a.m. Lift Up Your Heart.
BBC Forces Programme. 0700 hours News. 07:15 Morning Star. 07:30 On Parade, popular artists and bands.
Another German nuisance raid saw a tobacconist's roof in the Old Kent Road damaged as another incendiary bomb crashed through it just before 8 a.m. More incendiaries fell in the next 15 minutes, doing minor damage to a road surface and severe damage to a maritime engineers in Devonshire Grove before a couple of hours of peace.
The daily papers included adverts like this: accommodation available, vacancy, child 6 to 10 years, country house, 4 acres safety zone, governess, others, moderate fees, Mrs. O.P. Jank, Quinine House, Bishop Nympton.
Sport continued. The Coventry Herald noted football matches will be suspended during air raid warnings. According to instructions issued by the Ministry of Home Securities, the FA, spectators will be advised to take shelter on the ground, but not to run off elsewhere. Matches will not be abandoned unless the warning comes near the end.
The paper further noted the Bombay cricketer Ramdeep Garwar, who has taken many wickets in Coventry since he came here as a student at the Riley concern last October, has joined the RAF, Mr. Garwa, who is 25, has done plenty of flying, including 65 hours solo as a member of Bombay Flying Club. He believes he is the first Indian to join the RAF from the Midland District. He has played cricket for Riley in the Works Leagues and Friendlies and his Sunday games for Courtaulds. Medium-fast bowler, he took 7 wickets for 7 runs against Coventry. His second best performance was 8 for 32. In India, he played for Bombay City 11 and in an all-Indian side against the MCC.
BBC Home Services, 8 a.m. News. 8:15 a.m. The Kitchen Front. A talk about what to eat and how to cook it by Jean de Casales. 8:20 a.m. Edward O. Henry at the theatre organ. 8:40 a.m. Light music, played by A.H. Morgan's rhythmic players.
BBC Forces programme. On Parade continues. Popular artists and bands.
The radar stations report no enemy contacts until a single contact was made. 266 Squadron, Wittering, had recently been rotated out of the southeast from Hornchurch. 3 Spitfires were dispatched and finally intercepted the Dornier 215 as it closed on the Dutch border and shot it down.
Situations vacant today. Women and girls required for chocolate and confectionery work. Apply Carson's Chocolate Factory, Shortwood, near Mangersfield Station, Bristol. Wanted, married couple, no children, as caretakers at Clifton Undertakers premises. 3 rooms rent-free for services rendered, all hours when office is closed. House parlour made for country home, required, wages about £36, Mrs Hale, Blue Lodge, Warmley, Bristol. Charles and Sons of Bury St Edmunds needed heavy lorry drivers and mates to move beats around the country, while the Wiltshire and Trowbridge Advertiser noted the Semmington Institution were looking for a male attendant on mental defectives at £60, with the usual residential emoluments. Female attendants were to be paid £45 to £60. Hop pickers were required in Hereford.
Bristol's Royal Infirmary had been established by voluntary subscription in 1735, and today its honorary treasurer, Egbert Cadbury, thanked those who continue to support it via the Western Daily Press. Mr F. Champion sent 10 shillings, as did Mr E. Flower and the Women's Corporation Guild. The Garden Guild sent vegetables, the Prince's and Bristol's Little Theatre complimentary tickets, and Miss Potter sent plums.
The Illustrated London News were keen to keep their readers informed of progress in the war so far. Apart from a double-page spread showing 1,000 German planes which it was claimed had been shot down, they carried most of the page showing the useful tactics the Home Guard could now use when moving in the face of the enemy. The article claimed that one of the most surprising features of the war has been the rise of the Home Guard, a force that was not dreamed of 6 months ago, which has never received pay but has resolutely set about equipping and training itself for any eventuality. It has even developed a school where guerrilla warfare is being made into a science, and all the lessons learned from recent fighting are turned to profit. We publish here the first of a series of drawings of things that are taught at this school, now famous as Osterley Park, which we intend to give, believing they will form a useful and reliable handbook for readers and their friends who are in the Home Guard. The drawings on this page illustrate the act of moving without attracting attention. Many of the tricks are typical of Indian warfare, and Boy Scouts will recognise others, but they are being systematised at Osterley Park, and the why and wherefore exactly explained. The Anglo-Saxon race, it should be remembered, has always produced excellent guerrilla fighters, witness such names as Baden-Powell, T.E. Lawrence, Colonel Rogers, and innumerable Americans, when not stifled by authority.
BBC Home Services, 9 a.m. Clydebank Berg Band, conducted Charles Telfer. 9:30 a.m. Lewisham Hippodrome Orchestra, conducted by Harold Collins.
BBC Forces programme. On Parade, popular artists and bands continues.
RAF reconnaissance flights continue to pick up evidence of the build-up of barges in the ports of Dunkirk, Flushing and Calais.
The men and women who supplied information to the Home Intelligence Department began to gather their sources. The Ministry of Information had been set up by Neville Chamberlain in September 1939 and muddled its way through the early war. A mass observation report on this period, War Begins at Home, showed a lack of understanding by the authorities of what the public felt and believed. The Ministry of Information established the Home Intelligence Department to deal with this issue, and it produced its first report on the 18th of May 1940.
The HID workers charged with reporting in had to relay and filter information from according to their own internal history by casual conversations initiated or overheard on the way to work, and partly by a hurried series of visits to public houses and other places the public foregathered. This was augmented by BBC listener research surveys and questionnaires from bodies such as the Citizens Advice Bureau and W.H. Smith's and Sons. London received more exacting attention. Staff were asked to recruit useful contacts such as small shopkeepers, trade union officials, doctors and the like to achieve as a wide a spread of reports as possible.
The main summary of the HID report for the 7th of September was as follows. Morale is unchanged. Reaction to the Prime Minister's last speech can now be summarised. On the whole, it aroused less interest than his previous speeches, though it was well liked. The parts which created the interest were his references to sirens and number of houses demolished. As many people thought that 1,000 houses were destroyed at Ramsgate alone, there appears to have been some confusion between damage and destruction.
There is evidence to show that night raids cause far more upset to people than daylight raids.
There are still requests for clearer instructions to bus drivers in rural areas about what they are to do in air raid warnings.
Regional complaints that London receives excessive publicity for its raids, both in the press and on the wireless, while important provincial towns have to hide their identity even from themselves, is still reported. Local Information Committee and others associated with the works of the Ministry of Information contrast the lack of publicity given to the positive aspects of the Ministry's work with that given to the work of the Ministries of Food, Home Security, etc.
Having had his breakfast, Tom Betts, who lived in the Columbia buildings in Bethnal Green, went out knocking on doors to take orders for coke from the local gasworks. He was paid 3p a sack, which he would spend on pie and eels and the Saturday cinema.
BBC Home Services, Lewisham Hippodrome Orchestra, conducted by Harold Collins. 10:15, The Daily Service, from page 29 of New Every Morning and page 52 of Each Returning Day. 10:30 a.m, Music While You Work, played by Lord Thomas at the theatre organ.
BBC Forces Programme. On Parade, Popular Artists and Bands, continues. 10:30 hours, Music While You Work, played by Lloyd Thomas at the theatre organ.
After 2 hours of peace, the Luftwaffe called again. Incendiaries fell and burnt out the streets of Deptford, and, crossing the Thames, burnt a section of fencing down at 19 Vivian Road, Bethnal Green.
The German campaign to bomb Britain into submission through the destruction of airfields, aircraft factories and harbours had begun in earnest on the 8th of August. 16 days later, 2 wandering German bombers released bombs over London. Retaliating, 81 RAF planes go to Berlin to inflict minimal physical damage but huge embarrassment to head of the Luftwaffe Hermann Göring. Göring wanted revenge and wanted to assault London and so bring Churchill to seek terms. He consulted Albert Kesselring, commander of Luftwaffe 2, and Hugo Speer. Kesselring felt attacking London would be the knockout blow Göring was looking for. Speer did not. On 4th September, Hitler granted Göring the permission that he needed. The Führer announced that day at a huge rally in Berlin's Sportplatz that Britain's cities would be erased. This morning, Göring, commander of 2 Fliegerkorps, Bruno Lürzer and Kesselring drove to watch the Air Armada leave for England, calling on Luftwaffe fighter bases in the Pays de Calais.
The Broughton Hall versus St Helens Rec cricket match was cancelled due to the number of the visitors who had ARP duties.
having had a National Day of Prayer on 1st of October 1939, another on 26th of May 1940, and a prayerful day of Thanksgiving on 9th of June, another was planned for 8th of September. The Cheltenham Chronicle contained the thoughts of the Vicar of Tewkesbury, Canon E.P. Goff, saying, "If all the people who will throng our churches were people who Sunday by Sunday meet to pray and worship, how wonderful would the great united act of prayer be when these people joined their scattered prayers into one glorious whole." The Chronicle rather dyspeptically noted many of those who would attend the service had not been to church for years.
The daily papers had notices of who was preaching and at what time.
Those wishing to get away from it all and go to the seaside. The newspapers offered accommodation in at 236 Hornby Road, Blackpool for 6 shillings, full board with 4 meals, good food and tap basins. Aldrincham House in Crawley Bay let its ad with the fact that it was in the safety zone. The Brighton Standard was offering a handy guide to accommodation. For those seeking something more urban, the Kingsley Hotel near the British Museum had 200 rooms with hot and cold water and free electric heating. Bed, bath and breakfast from 9/6.
The fallout of the fall of France, as well as the Norwegian campaign, continued to fill the morning papers. Many, like the Coventry Standard, had lists of those now held prisoner, such as Captain Kenneth Keane, Royal Warwickshire Regiment, son of Mr. and Mrs. Keane of 23 Northumberland Road, Coventry, Private O.G. John, Royal Regiment, and Private A.A. Brown, Warwickshire Regiment, both 64 Old Church Road, Green and Stoker, George Hill, H.M. Submarine Shara, husband of Mrs. Hill, 737 Sewell Highway, Coventry.
The Scotsman carried a small personal ad. Macpherson, FOA, DFC reported missing May 12th. Would relatives of the above kindly communicate to Mrs. Gregory of Foston Hall, York, who desires information of her son, Sergeant Gregory, observers in same plane missing, same date. Francis Winnell Gregory was the 23-year-old son of Lieutenant Colonel Edward and Mrs. Julia Gregory of Halberton, Devon. He was flying in a Blenheim light bomber from the 109 Squadron when he was shot down and killed on 12th of May near Lanarken in Belgium. He and Macpherson, aged 22, were buried in the Commonwealth War Grave Cemetery at Haverley when it was established in 1946.
While regional football continued, teams did not always have a full squad. Blackburn Rovers had 5 guest players: Jackson and Britton from Everton, Quillis from Wolves, Bartram from Charlton, and Frank O'Donnell from Aston Villa in their match against Liverpool.
London was a city of exiles, and one of those was an instructor at Osterley Park known as Ricardo the Basque.
Ricardo was an explosive expert and he was praised for his skill, but he worried some trainees with his lack of care for safety.
We now go over to our special reporter.
This is a news report from London. You might have read Mr. Tom Winteringham's inspiring articles about how to fight back if Herr Hitler's Nazis ever tried to take a beach holiday in the south of England. Now, hundreds of Home Guards from all over the country are learning the skills of irregular soldiers from Mr. Winteringham himself at the Earl of Jersey's house in Osterley Park, West London. When, a few weeks ago, Mr. Winteringham suggested starting a school for Home Guards, the Earl, who owns Mr. Winteringham's employer, Picture Post magazine, imposed only one condition. You can blow up what you like in the grounds, but don't damage the house as we're rather fond of it. It was designed by Robert Adam, said the Earl, but he need not have worried. Like Mr. Winteringham, the staff are all disciplined men who have practical military skills, most learned in Flanders and in the recent conflict in Spain. For example, one trainer, Mr. Slater, was Chief of Operations in the International Brigade. And look, there is Ricky the Spaniard, teaching the students how to snake crawl up to a tank and blow its track off, just like he did at the crossing of the Ebro. But there are others who have adapted their skills to the fight for freedom. For example, the well-known painter Mr. Penrose has swapped the galleries in London and Paris to teach camouflage. And don't be concerned at suggestions the tutors at Osterley are all fifth columnists and agents of Chairman Stalin. There is only one enemy now, Herr Hitler. And besides, one of the tutors is Mr. White of the Boy Scouts. Our reporter also bumped into a photographer from Picture Post, so expect to read more about this most unusual school very soon. Meanwhile, rest assured, if Mr. Hitler's parachutists drop into Osterley Park, Mr. Wintringham and the Home Guards will be delighted to serve them cocktails. The very warm kind, which was served up by the brave Finns to Mr. Molotov's tanks last winter.
BBC Home Services, 11 a.m. Song Recital, Elsie Boardman contralto and Reginald Charles baritone. 11:30 a.m. BBC Salon Orchestra.
BBC Forces Programme. 1100 hours, songs from the screen, gramophone records of cinema music presented by Charles Maxwell. 11:30 hours, BBC Salon Orchestra.
11 p.m. The Lords 11 versus Middlesex 11 begins at Lords. Lieutenant B.D. Carris and J. Engelstone opened. Bertram Carris had played for Middlesex since 1937 and Cambridge University since 1938. He did not continue to play after the war. Jim Engelstone had joined the Lords ground staff in 1938, played Middlesex second 11 cricket before the war and made his first-class debut in 1947.
German reconnaissance planes were reported over Yorkshire.
The Home Intelligence Department for the Eastern Cambridge area reported as follows.
Morale is high, owing to the fact that the region is now fully accustomed to air raid warnings, and because raids themselves have lately been less frequent, there is less feeling of anxiety. There are some complaints about the amount of working time which is lost through warnings. Traffic conditions east and west across Norfolk are reported as being very difficult when raids have occurred in that area. This refers particularly to bus services.
11:30 a.m. Lieutenant Colonel Rodney Foster, late of the British Indian Army and Superintendent of the Survey of India, volunteered for the LDV in Hythe. He had persuaded the authorities that his Home Guard work meant he should not be evacuated from his coastal home. However, he had moved his wife a little inland. His diary records, "No early morning alarm, but one sounded at 11:30 a.m. as I drove off to Bog Farm."
The Stirlingshire War Relief Fund gave notice of its intentions today, as required by the War Charities Act 1940. Its intention was to raise money for relief of dependents of enlisted men, supplying of comforts to men serving with HM forces, County Red Cross Fund, St Andrew's Ambulance Association, the Lord Lieutenant's Fund, to which donations not otherwise earmarked will be applied, and from which aid will be given to the above-mentioned objects and other organisations in the county having similar aims. Prisoners of War Parcels Fund. The part played by many North East men in the Battle of Britain is necessarily one of watching and waiting. If there are no Nazis to fight, there is another powerful enemy: boredom. Games are urgently needed for sending to men stationed at lonely outposts. That spare pack of cards or that drafts board you have done with will mean much to men for whom leisure is a problem. If you have any games or puzzles for which you have no further use, please send them to the Games section, Comforts Depot, 37 Albin Place, Aberdeen. Wireless sets and musical instruments are other gifts which men living under active service conditions appreciate deeply. If you have no games, send a gift of money to help to buy these other comforts. Address your donation to Comforts Fund, Press and Journal, 20 Broad Street, Aberdeen.
11:55 a.m. Pevensey Dover radar stations pick up a small formation of German planes just off the coast. 66 Squadron, who are flying a routine patrol, intercept, and they turn out to be ME-109s. They disengage when two of the Spitfires are forced out of action. One crash-landed closest to Hawkage and the other when returning to the base.
The German campaign to bomb London into submission through the destruction of airfields, aircraft factories and harbours had begun in earnest on 8th of August. 16 days later, 2 wandering German bombers released bombs over London. Retaliating, 81 RAF planes went to Berlin to inflict minimal physical damage but huge embarrassment to the head of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring. Göring wanted revenge and wanted to assault London and so bring Churchill to terms. He consulted Albert Kesselring, commander of Luftflotte 2, and Hugo Spohr, who led Luftflotte 3. Kesselring felt attacking London would be the knockout blow that Göring was looking for. Spohr did not. On the 4th of September, Hitler granted Göring permission, and the Führer announced that day in a huge rally in Berlin's Spottplatz that British cities would be erased.
BBC Home Services. 12 o'clock. Orchestral concert conducted by Guy Warwick.
BBC Forces Programme. 1200 hours, Here's a Health to His Majesty, a programme of national songs. 12:15, News in French. 12:30, Reginald Foote. At the Theatre Organ.
12 p.m. respondents begin to phone reports in for the Daily Home Intelligence Report.
The Home Intelligence Department for the Southern, Reading, read as follows. Although nerves are somewhat frayed by the constant movement of enemy planes, the public continues to be in a fairly cheerful frame of mind. There is some divergence of opinion about the attitude which the public should take towards the sounding of sirens. Whereas Southampton LIC stresses the necessity for people not to jump up and seek shelter directly the sirens go, Totton Subcommittee thinks that people should be educated to pay more attention to warnings.
12:05 p.m, Pilot Officer Donald Sanders took off from 54 Squadron's new base at Catterick. The 21-year-old had joined the squadron 4 days earlier when it had been at Hornchurch as a replacement from his operational training unit. The squadron was then rotated to Yorkshire and Sanders was engaged in low-level training. He crashed and was killed.
2 reports of German bombs this hour saw an unexploded bomb in a Lewisham garden and an incendiary damaging the roof of a house in Mile End.
BBC Home Services. 1 p.m. News. 1:15 p.m. Back to the Land by John Morgan MP. Followed by a talk on pigeons by Major W.H. Osman. 1:35 p.m. Chalumeau Ensemble, playing light music.
BBC Forces Programme. 1300 hours, News in Dutch. 13:15, The Two of Us, Donald Edge and Charles Groves, at 2 pianos in the programme of Rhythm and Melody.
The gale that had been tracking across Scotland peaked at Dumfries at 1 o'clock with 58 miles per hour winds. The Scottish Isles were coping much the same either side of 1 o'clock.
1:30 p.m. An auction begins at the Bale Room, Middle Street, North Driffield. C.O. Ray had many items to sell, including 2 walnut bedroom suites, an inlaid mahogany washstand, gramophone cabinet, bamboo table, oil cooker, corrugated iron and joiner's tools.
At 1:34 p.m, an incendiary bomb damages 110 Skidmore Street Tower Hamlets.
The Home Intelligence Department for Wales, Cardiff, read as follows. There is no change in the feelings of the public, upon whom the war of nerves is having little effect. There has been a wonderful reaction to the Prime Minister's speech.
The Home Guard continued to develop, even if the name had not quite disappeared. The Rochdale Observer advertised for mobile support. LDV, A Company to all car owners in Norden, Bagslett and Bamford. Volunteers with cars urgently wanted for transport duties, taking observation parties to posts, reconnaissance, field exercises, etc. Please apply, giving type and HP of car and times available to Transport Officer F. Grinrod Dean, 630 Berry Road, Bamford. Telephones Haywood 6338 and Rochdale 4151, or Company HQ, Liberal Club, Norden.
The Women Citizens Detachment Red Cross opened its Bring and Buy sale at Brayside, Forfar. Mr John Ogilvie, the County Director, and Mrs Gray Cheap performed the opening ceremony. The fruit and home produce stall was run by Mrs Shepherd and Mrs Smith. Cake, candy and work was run by Miss Langlands and Mrs Esplin, while Mrs Melville provided the teas. An American tennis tournament was organised by Mr Winton of the Forfar Tennis Club.
American tennis was designed for circumstances when only 3 players were available. The doubles pair were only allowed to hit into the singles area of the court and vice versa. In addition, after each game the players rotate and so take it in turns to be the single or double players.
2 reports of German bombs this hour saw an unexploded bomb in a Lewisham garden and an incendiary damaging the roof of a house in Mile.
David Ross was one of the older recruits for HMT Abronia. Aged 52, his family came from Leith and had, until he joined the Royal Navy Patrol Service, lived in Redgrace Place, Edinburgh. Serving at sea was a family tradition. His son, also called David, was in the Merchant Navy. Ross would be in Abronia's engine room.
Warwick Leslie Noseworthy was not British, but came from St. John's, Newfoundland. In 1940, it was ruled by the British-appointed Commission of Government. It had become a key area in the Battle of the Atlantic Convoys. The 24-year-old Warwick had volunteered for the Royal Navy Patrol Services for, quote, hostilities only, end quote, and was an ordinary seaman.
Cyril Cornelius George Burroughs was born on the 15th of April 1915 in Wainfleet, St. Mary. An electrician by training, he had joined the Royal Navy by September 1939 on a hostiles-only enlistment. In July 1940, he had married Kathleen Vinter. Serving as a wireman, he was in the minority on the trawler, as most were not Royal Navy recruits but part of the Royal Navy Patrol Service.
Second-hand William Lewis Union had been born into a seafaring family from Pembrokeshire. Born in 1907, he married Gwendolen, the Cardiff daughter of a steamboat engineer. In 1939 register, taken on 29th of September, to create lists for the issuing of identity cards, already listed William as being in the Royal Navy Reserve. He lived at 1 Vickery Street, Milford Haven, with 5 children and their boarders, Beatrice Davis, wife of a deep-sea fisherman, and her 10-day-old son.
BBC Home Services, 2 p.m. Music on the Train, a programme of gramophone records. 2:30 p.m. Fairy Aviation Works Band, conductor Harry Mortimer.
BBC Forces Programme, 1400 hours, Tommy Rotters, an inconsequential affair in Scots. 1430 hours, the Fairy Aviation Works Band, conductor Harry Mortimer.
2 p.m. marked the last opportunity for football pools coupons to arrive and be counted towards today's games, although many seem to have been collected on Thursday nights for dispatch. In 1923, John Moores had set up Littlewoods, handing out coupons outside Old Trafford. Vernon's in 1925 and Zetta's in 1933 joined together to establish the Pools Promoters Association in 1934. They accounted for about 3/4 of all pools bets. However, 100 smaller independent firms also offered a service. In one of the more Laurel and Hardy moments of the 1930s, the FA and League rejected an attempt by the pools companies to pay for the right to use league fixtures and attempted to thwart Littlewood Hotel by keeping fixtures secret from them and the fans. It didn't work. By 1938-39, stakes were estimated at £22.5 million. Wartime restrictions shaped the nature of the pools. To save paper, the coupons were published in newspapers, and the companies combined to provide one Unity pools. The amount wagered fell to a low in 1940-41, £3.5 million. Littlewood, Liverpool headquarters, became a postal centre.
2 p.m. for Vauxhall, North Somerset. Spitfire Fund opened its market and produce stall at the boys' school. It was due to end at dusk. The fund had been set up by the Women's Institute and in a week had raised about £62, 5 shillings and 6 pennies. Blackberries, picked by local school children, were also available at the stall.
Crowdfunding the Battle of Britain began in May 1940. The notional figure of £5,000 a plane was set to inspire communities to dig deep. The Rochdale Observer carried a list of contributors to their fund, which covered a page and a half and was set in numerical order. So far, they had raised £10,814, 19 shillings and 5 pence. And having sent the first £5,000 to Lord Beaverbrook, Minister of Aircraft Production, they printed his reply thanking the people for their generosity. The typical Rochdale donation was between £1 and £2, given by a family or group of people living in a single house, such as Mr. and Mrs. H. Brokenshaw of 37 Falkland Avenue. Larger donations tended to come from groups of workers or whole businesses, such as the £70 from the directors, staff and employees.
BBC Home Services. 3 p.m. Music While You Work, played by Percival Mackay and his band. 3:30 p.m. Act 2 of Puccini's opera Tosca, performed by the Sadler's Wells Company.
BBC Forces Programme. 1500 hours. Music While You Work, played by Percival Mackay and his band. 15:30. Gordon Banner at the theatre organ. 15:50. Scottish music on the gramophone. The London Palladium Orchestra, conducted by Richard Green.
6 league football matches were being staged in London area. Football was mostly a Saturday afternoon affair, especially when the autumn nights drew in and banished matches from midweek. Despite dominating the 1930s on the field, Arsenal's status did not give them the weight to pursue the Football League to allow the dangerous novelty of floodlights. The game had grown out of its Midland and northern industrial heartlands by 1939 and spread into 4 English and 2 Scottish professional leagues. Everton had won the league in 1939 and Portsmouth the FA Cup. Grimsby, Charlton and Brentford won the top flight, and Manchester City, Tottenham and West Ham won.
When war came again, the government and footballing authorities attempted to modify the leagues to allow the needed entertainment but reduce the amount of travel and the risk of large crowds gathering. This didn't stop 42,399 people from turning up in Wembley on the 8th of June, 4 days after the last troops were landed from Dunkirk. They saw Sam Small score West Ham's only goal as they beat Blackburn Rovers in the First War League Cup. By the start of the 40-41 season, the competition settled down to English North and South regional leagues and the Scottish Southern League. Troops and Leave were still playing. In today's Stoke-Notts County match, the Potters had 3 soldiers in the squad, while the Pies included Snedden and Griffith, who usually played for Manchester United, and also Kilmarnock's Scottish international, Beattie.
31 English matches kicked off, played before 66,000 fans. Most matches were against relatively nearby neighbours. In Scotland, 40,000 turned out to see Celtic play Rangers.
The new crew of HMT Abronia arrived to take up duty.
The Home Intelligence Department for the South Eastern region, Tunbridge Wells, read as follows. In spite of continuous raids, morale remains at a high level throughout the region. There are some complaints from Eastbourne at the ban on visitors, and if the local authorities were told why it is not possible to give the facilities which are granted to Brighton, it would help to do away with this grievance.
3:40 p.m. Fourness radar station begins to pick up blips off the French coast. The blips slowly merge as German plane after plane takes to the sky. Soon after, Dover and Rye stations pick up the formations.
3:50 p.m. Rodney Foster records alarm 3:50 p.m. to 7 p.m. Huns went over in masses, far more than there have ever been.
The evening papers began to make their way out. The headlines were Dundee Evening Telegraph, biggest raid yet on Berlin.
BBC Home Services. Act 2 of Puccini's opera Tosca, continued. 4:15 p.m. Things I Cannot Forget. A talk by Dr. P.B. Ballard. 4:30 p.m. Any more?
BBC Forces programme. Scottish music on the gramophone continued. 16:10 hours. Violin pieces by Frederick Grink. 16:30. Any more?
At 4:14 p.m., 348 German bombers, escorted by 617 fighters, begin to cross British airspace. The formation occupied 800 square miles.
4:15 p.m. The Observer Post begin to report sightings of German aircraft to the Maidstone HQ.
4:20 p.m. RAF Scramble 1 Squadron, Norfolk, 303 Squadron, Norfolk, 501 Squadron, Gravesend, 504 Squadron, Hendon.
4:25 p.m. RAF Scramble 249 Squadron, North Weald, and 253 Squadron, Kenley.
4:30 p.m. RAF Scramble 43 Squadron, Tangmere, 73 Squadron, North Weald, 111 Squadron, Croydon, and 253 Squadron, Bigging Hill.
On Reigate Hill, the Civil Defence volunteers asked for sunbathers to take shelter under the trees. No one took too much notice until some Canadian troops set up a machine gun post to stop dive bombers. Colin Perry moved himself to a small footbridge over a nearby main road, but after half an hour had seen the RAF, but no Germans.
Jack Graham Wright, an architectural student, was living at home in Plumstead. His mother had just brought the tray from the kitchen with the afternoon tea when they looked out to see the Luftwaffe arrive. "What are all those little bright things underneath them?" his mother asks. At that point, they decided to retreat to the cupboard under the stairs.
6 league football matches were being staged in the London area when the German bombers attacked.
That was part one of The Weekend the Germans Didn't Invade, Waiting, performed by the wider community at the Axholme Academy, with special thanks to Marlene Sidaway, Simon Reddy, Andy Brockman, Tim Egling, Jamie Jeffers, Richard Baxell, Susan Bennyworth and Rachel Jardine. A full cast list will be available at the end of part 3.